This is Karama's Girl 018, and this is my next part of the reading of the Stolen Throne. I am so sorry for the delay on this, but I have been busy, and there have been things that have happened in my life lately that I just haven't gotten around to doing more readings. I hope to try and remedy that. Anyway, here's part 2 of chapter 4. Merrick was glad to see Rowan. Overjoyed, in fact. Or had been, until she punched him in the face. As far as he was concerned, there had been entirely too much punching in the face lately. After he picked himself off of the ground, hasty explanations were made, and none too soon. Rowan had stirred herself into a frenzy, or to a fury. He had always had a knack for provoking her temper. When he was a child, he often blithely enraged Rowan and then ran to his mother for protection. She would simply smile down at him in amusement and leave him to Rowan's tender mercies. By the time he got older, he learned to see the warning signs for himself, though apparently that skill had become a tad rusty. Rowan and her men had seen their fire from a distance and assumed Logain was Merrick's captor. In fact, she had seen Merrick reclining and believed him unconscious or dead. Upon discovering that he not only didn't run away when he had the chance, but actually defended Logain, she had then assumed they were conspirators, and Merrick had, what, run away? He supposed, though she stopped short of saying just that. It took a considerable amount of convincing before Rowan grudgingly believed that they had been on their way to the rebel camp, and that Logain was, in fact, responsible for Merrick's survival to date. "Oh," Rowan said, finally looking at Logain. She didn't seem all that impressed. "I suppose I owe you an apology then, sir." Her overt suspicion didn't make it sound much like an apology, but Logain seemed more amused than offended. "It seems that you do," he said, offering his hand. "Logain McTeer, at your service." Rowan Guerin. Her look remained dubious, probably since most men would have bowed and perhaps taken her fingers in the usual courtly fashion, even if Merrick knew she didn't care for it. She took Logain's hand and he gave it a firm shake. She removed her hand from the contact a bit too eagerly, as if Logain had some unsightly and possibly infectious skin condition that she was much too polite to comment on. "And I doubt I'll be needing your service, sir." "It's a figure of speech, not a proposal." "It's Lady Rowan," Merrick interjected helpfully. "She's the daughter of the Earl of Redcliffe, who is probably still with the army, I hope." "Yes." Rowan's gaze lingered uncertainly on Logain a moment longer before she turned her attention back to Merrick. She frowned at him with concern. "We searched everywhere for you, Merrick. Father's all but given you up for dead. He's wanted to move the army for days now, but I begged him to let me keep looking." She softened, touching his cheek with uncharacteristic tenderness. "Maker's breath, Merrick. When we heard what they had done to the Queen, we were so afraid they'd killed you too. Or worse, put you in one of the usurper's dungeons." She hugged him tightly against her breastplate. "But you're alive." "You are!" Merrick allowed himself to be crushed, sending Logain a pleading look that said, "For the love of the Maker, help me!" Logain merely stood by, appearing vaguely entertained. "I would do." When Rowan released Merrick, she paused and stared at him as if uncertain how to proceed. "Your mother." "They killed her in front of me." He nodded miserably. "The usurper had her body sent to Denerim. He's declared a holiday, had her paraded." She stopped herself short, her voice raw. "You don't want to know this." "No, probably not." He'd heard about the usurper's fondness for putting his enemies on display, and no doubt the rebel queen was a great prize for him. His mind shied away from the unbidden images that conjured. None of them were pleasant. Logain leaned forward, clearing his throat with exaggerated politeness. "Not to interrupt, your ladyship." "Rowan will do," she interrupted. Logain glanced questioningly at Merrick, who spread his hands as if helpless. "Not to interrupt, Rowan," he repeated. "But perhaps we should get under way. You might not be the only one who saw our fire." She stepped back from Merrick, all business once again. Studying the horizon with concern, she nodded. "Good point." She turned back to the horsemen, watching politely from nearby. "Leave 2 of the horses here. The rest of you can double up. I want you to ride back and inform my father that I found the prince." The men looked uncertain, perhaps reluctant to leave her unguarded. "Go," she repeated more forcefully. "We will be right behind you." And they went, exchanging their places on the horses without comment. the one soldier whom Logain had dragged from his steed, limping and needing assistance before riding off in a cloud. "Father's had some odd reports," Rowan commented it to Merrick as they left. "There's been a lot of men sighted in the hinterlands. The usurper's men looking for you, or so we thought." She sighed heavily. "We may have stayed here too long." "And you sent away your guards?" "As distractions," Logain said with a hint of approval. Rowan remounted her horse. "If we did run into the enemy, a few more men wouldn't make much difference." She glanced at Merrick and smiled mischievously. "Besides, as I recall, you're a fine rider. We'll just outrun them if need be." Merrick ignored her and mounted his own horse. It was a shaky business requiring several bounces as the startled animal proceeded to pace forward and drag him along before he was actually on top. Once perched precariously on the saddle, he did his best to try and stay there. His discomfort was pronounced enough to make the horse nicker nervously. "I fall off horses," he explained to Logain with a sickly grin. "It's the thing I do." "Let's not run into anyone, then." Logain seemed to have no trouble riding, and as if to prove it, he trotted around Merrick and brought his horse to stand beside Rowan's. Merrick watched him with a grimace and thought, "Well, of course he's a good rider, too. Why wouldn't he be?" Rowan seemed to be thinking the same thing, glancing curiously at him. "You have experience riding. That's unusual for She paused, searching for a tactful word. "A commoner?" he finished for her. He snorted derivously. "That's an interesting world view coming from someone who lives in the wilderness and probably has to beg her meals from cowards." Rowan's jaw set, and her eyes flashed with anger. Merrick decided against warning Logain about her temper. He was a grown man, after all. The sort who could ride and everything. "I meant," she said curtly, "that it's not everyone who has access to horses. My father raised them on our farmhold. He taught me." "Did he teach you your manners, too?" "No, that was my mother," he replied coldly. "Or at least she tried to before she was raped and killed by the Orlesians." Rowan's eyes were wide as Logain turned and rode away. Merrick steered his horse over towards hers with difficulty. "So," he announced, "that was a bit awkward." She stared at him as if he had suddenly sprouted 2 extra heads. Just to change the subject, he cleared his throat. "Are we planning on following those other men you sent off? Because if we are, they're getting out of sight really quickly. Really quickly, in fact." "Well, there they go." "No," Rowan said firmly. "We're taking a slightly different route." "Shouldn't we get underway, then?" "Yes." She put her helmet back on and rode ahead without another word, the green plume trailing behind her. Watching her, Merrick wondered how it might have been for Rowan in a normal world. Ferelden's were a rugged and practical people, and women who could hold their own in combat were respected as much as the men. But it was different among the nobility. Had it not been for the rebellion, the Earl would have had his daughter wearing fine dresses and learning the latest dances from the Orlesian court rather than helping to lead his army. Rowan's family had made many sacrifices for the rebellion. All Rendorn had given up his beloved Redcliffe to the usurper. His wife, the Arlessa, had died from fever on the road, and he had sent his 2 younger sons, Eamon and Tegan, away to live with cousins in the far north. Spoilers! Who knew if the Earl's sons would even recognize him if they returned now? They had given up a great deal to help Merrick's mother, and now she was gone. This wasn't a normal world at all. They rode into the hills, taking a route that Rowan was noticeably familiar with. Merrick wondered just how often she had passed over this territory looking for him, and why she had bothered. He was his mother's heir without question, but it must have seemed quite hopeless that anyone would chance across him out in the open after the first few days. They should have moved on without him. The rocky terrain was difficult to ride through, and Merrick was pleased that he managed to stay on his horse. They stopped only once when he realized that Logain was still bleeding from the wound in his chest left by the flail. Merrick flagged down Rowan and then practically had them wrestle Logain off his horse so they could bandage him properly. Logain naturally seemed more irritated than anything by the delay, causing Merrick to wonder if he could take a flail to the chest delivered from horseback and still walk away, to be stubborn about it. Probably not. Eventually, they started to see evidence of the rebel army's presence. They rode past several sentries who saluted Rowan before they recognized Merrick and stared, mouths agape. Evidently, the word had not quite gotten out. It wasn't long before they got among the tents and into the heart of the camp, situated mostly in a small valley that almost completely hid it from sight. Merrick's mother had loved the hinterlands because it had so many valleys just like this one, so many spots for the army to take refuge in. Sorry. They could access most of the northern lowlands quickly while still being able to retreat quickly. His mother had slowly built the army here from nothing to a force that had been the vexation of the Orlesians for more than a decade now. Logan looked around at the many tents they passed with some degree of surprise. It looked much like the outlaw camp had, to tell the truth, but on a larger scale. The tents were worn and dirty, as were most of the soldiers, and generally it was all that anyone could do to keep so many hundreds of men fed from day to day. The rebels were the product of years of recruitment from among the ranks of angry noblemen, men who had decided it was worth abandoning their own lands and taking what loyal followers and supplies they could to join an uncertain cause without much hope of compensation. Those who couldn't join sometimes offered food and shelter when they had it to spare, which wasn't often. Merrick's mother had been reduced to begging more than once. Logan had been right on that point, too. Sorry. As soon as the first cry of, "It's the prince!" went up, men and women started spilling out of the tents and surrounding their horses. Only a few at first, but after a short time, they were mobbed. The soldiers surrounded them, joy showing on their filthy faces as many hands reached out towards Merrick. "The prince! He's alive! It's the prince!" A general cheer wailed up from the crowd, a sound of relief and excitement. Some of the older men were actually crying. Crying! And some of them were hugging and pounding their fists in the air. Rowan removed her helmet, and he saw there were tears in her eyes as well. She reached over from her horse and raised Merrick's hand, and the cheer escalated to a roar of approval. They had loved his mother this much. It must have been devastating to lose the very reason most of them were here. Deeply moved, Merrick realized that having him back among them was a victory of sorts, like having a piece of Queen Mora back. He choked up at the thought of her. Rowan squeezed his hand. She understood. Logan remained slightly behind them, looking pained and out of place. Merrick turned and urged him forward. If anything, he was the main reason Merrick had made it back to the army at all. Logan shook his head, however, and remained where he was. Thunderous footsteps resounded as a 10-foot-tall creature made of stone slowly lumbered toward the crowd from deeper in the camp. The cheering dimmed as some of the men respectfully got out of the creature's way, but most just accepted the creature for the common sight it was here. Logan stared at it in shock. "What is that?" Merrick chuckled, wiping his eyes. "Oh, that's just the golem. Nothing to get excited about." He would have laughed at Logan's incredulous look had the golem's owner not appeared and pushed through the crowd of soldiers. He was tall but thin enough to appear gaunt and spindly, as opposed to intimidating. If men scrambled to get out of his way, it was because of the bright robes marking him as a ranking enchanter of the Circle of Magi. "Prince Merrick," he called out, frowning with familiar impatience. The mage had served the Earl as a retainer and advisor for years now, and had been on good terms with Merrick's mother. He had always treated Merrick himself as a recalcitrant student sorely in need of discipline. However, though this was not unusual, the mage was perpetually displeased, always frowning and looking down past his hawkish nose at others. Still, he was loyal and trustworthy. So Merrick swallowed his distaste and nodded to the man as he approached. "I found him, Wilhelm." Rowan laughed. "Wait, Wilhelm? As in, was that golem Shale?" "Whoa." "I can see that, my lady," the mage grumped. The cheering continued, but Wilhelm ignored it, and turned to regard Merrick with open suspicion. "Rather convenient timing, Prince Merrick." "Why do you say that?" "First, let's see if you are who you claim." Wilhelm made subtle gestures with his hands, his intense gaze seeming to burrow into Merrick's skull. Glowing embers swirled around him, brightening until the magic was evident to the entire crowd. The cheering skidded to a halt, and most of the men immediately near the spout backed up so quickly many of them actually fell. "Wilhelm!" From her horse, Rowan grabbed his wrist. "That is not necessary." "It is," he snapped, wrenching his hand free. He finished casting, the words uttered just barely audibly under his breath, and Merrick felt the magic wash over him. It was a tickle of pinpricks dancing upon his skin and behind his eyes. Logan watched nervously from nearby, but only worked to keep his horse calm. Wilhelm then stood back, apparently satisfied with whatever his magic had discovered. My apologies, Your Highness. I had to be sure. I think I would know Merrick if I saw him, don't you? Rowan said crisply. No, I'm not sure that you would. Wilhelm turned to face the quiet masses of soldiers that were now staring at him. Men, he called out, you must prepare for battle. Your prince has returned to you. Now ready to defend him. As if to punctuate his shouts, the stone golem fell into place directly behind him, scanning the crowd with its fearsome, baleful eyes. I think that is Shale. The soldiers immediately burst into life, several commanders among them bellowing orders. Merrick stared at the mage with growing alarm. Why? What's going on? Come, I'll let the Arl explain. The mage turned and briskly walked deeper into the camp, the golem lumbering after him. Merrick and Rowan exchanged a look and dismounted. A man ran up and took their horses. Logain remained mounted, however, and looked down at Merrick awkwardly. Perhaps this is a good time for me to leave, he said. And go where, exactly? Sorry. Merrick frowned up at Logain, but Rowan took him by the arm and led him after the mage before he could receive an answer. He allowed himself to be taken away, but looked back as they walked. Logain seemed vastly out of place, sitting there as the man waited expectantly to take his horse. Merrick almost felt sorry for him. Eventually, Logain sighed and dismounted, surrendering his horse before running to catch up. The activity among the soldiers grew more intense as they went further into the valley. Something was definitely amiss. Soldiers were falling into formation. Tents were being torn down rapidly. Everyone seemed to be running and shouting all at once. It seemed to Merrick to be controlled chaos, something he was not unused to. There was an edge of panic to it all that he didn't like, however. He had seen his mother's army scramble many times to flee before an attack by the usurper's forces. This had the feeling to it. At the center of all the activity he saw Arl Rendorn, Rowan's father. He was hard to miss in his silverite plate arm mail, a gift from Merrick's mother to her most trusted friend in general many years before. Silver-haired and distinguished, the Arl was the very picture of nobility, and Merrick found himself feeling more than a little relieved to see him. The man was giving orders to the soldiers around him with quick, efficient precision. The soldiers never needed repeating and were obeyed without question. Wilhelm waved to the Arl, though it was hardly necessary, as the stone giant behind him drew notice from almost everyone. The Arl turned, and upon seeing Merrick, he strode forward through several ranks of men to greet him with a wide and happy grin. "Merrick!" he shouted, clapping Merrick on the shoulder. "It is you!" "That's what everyone keeps telling me," Merrick grinned. "Maker be praised." His eyes grew sad for a moment. "Your mother will be proud to see that you survived. Well done, lad." "I told you I would find him, father," Rowan said. The Arl regarded his daughter with a look that was both impressed and eternally frustrated. So you did. I should never have doubted you, pup." He turned then embarked several sharp orders to his immediate lieutenants, who were staring at Merrick dumbly. Now they snapped to attention and took over whatever preparations had been underway. "Come," the Arl said, "let us move inside. Whatever tale you have will need to wait. You've come in an awkward moment, truth be told, and not a minute too soon." He stepped to the large red tent immediately behind him and held open the flap. Ugh, sorry. Wilhelm brushed inside imperiously, as if the honor should have been his to begin with. Truly, Merrick had never understood why Rendorn put up with such behavior from a man who was technically a retainer, hired from the circle of magi. The Earl, however, appeared to be more amused than offended by Wilhelm's antics. Their amusement disappeared instantly, however, when he saw Logain approach. He put up a hand to stop Logain from entering the tent. "Hold now, who's this?" Logain paused, regarding the Earl's hand with a raised brow. "It's Logain," he said. "Logain McTeer." "He came with me," Merrick offered helpfully. The Earl narrowed his eyes suspiciously. "I've never heard of you, or your family." "There's no reason you should." The two men locked eyes, bristling. Merrick stepped forward between the two, putting up his hands to halt any imminent escalation. "Logain helped me," Merrick told Rendon, keeping his voice restrained. "He's the reason I'm here, your grace. If it hadn't been for him and his father, I probably wouldn't have made it at all." Arl Rendon paused, digesting this before nodding to Logain. "If that's true, then it's greatly appreciated. You did a great service, and I'll see to it you're rewarded." "I'm not interested in any reward." "As you wish." With a frown, the Earl turned to Merrick. "I just need to speak with you, lad, and it's not a discussion to be held in front of any commoners, especially men we don't know." He bowed politely to Logain. "No offense, sir." "None taken," Logain growled. Rendorn turned to enter the tent, considering the matter closed, but Merrick interposed himself in front of him. He is not a commoner. The Earl looked startled by Merrick's vehemence. So did Rowan, who quietly raised her eyebrows from a step away. Even Logain looked at Merrick as if he might have gone slightly mad. He's the son of a knight, Merrick insisted, a man who died in my service. He also saved my life more than once, and I will see him treated accordingly. Rowan's father glowered at Merrick, the moment thick with tension. He turned an appraising eye toward Logain, who felt like he felt compelled to speak but wasn't quite sure what to say. Instead, he met the Earl's stare with a simple shrug and the slightest hint of an insolent grin. Fine, Endorn snapped. I've no time to argue. He held the flap open and let Logain and the others through, then followed them inside. The golem stood silent guarding beside the entrance. The tent's interior was dominated by the worn table around which Merrick's mother had gathered the Earl and her other commanders. Significantly, the larger chair she had occupied for as long as Merrick could remember stood vacant. He tried not to stare at it. The usurper's men are marching on us as we speak, Earl Rendon announced as soon as the tent flap was closed. They did not sit down. Our situation is desperate. They know where we are and managed to almost surround us before we became aware of their approach. Magic. Wilhelm's hawk-like face twisted into a disapproving scowl. The usurper has gone to great lengths to plan this attack. Plan? Roland frowned, but how could he have known we would still be here? You would already have left if I still hadn't insisted we look for Merrick. The Earl shrugged. Perhaps they expect us to do just that. Or perhaps someone told them we intended to remain where we were. There's no shortage of Fereldans willing to sell us out, Merrick sighed. That's what got my mother killed, after all. There is a plan, the Earl stated. Now that you're here, lad, we have hope. All is not lost. They haven't surrounded us completely. If we leave now, take only a small number of men with us, and use Wilhelm's magic to our advantage, we can slip out of this noose before it tightens. And what of the army? Merrick asked. Rowan nodded gravely, already in agreement with her father. It's lost. She put her hand on Merrick's shoulder. It's already lost. It's you we need to get out, Merrick. The royal line rests with you. No, we can't abandon the army. That's madness. We can rebuild the army again, just as your mother did. The Earl sighed heavily. The fact that Rowan found you just in time is a sign from the Maker. We need to take you away from here before it's too late. No, Merrick paced angrily, staring at Rowan and her father in outrage. I can't believe what I'm hearing. I didn't come here just to lose my mother's entire army. We have to do something. There's nothing to be done, lad, the Earl said gently. We've got two groups bearing down on us, one from the north and a larger force coming through the forest in the east. They've got us cornered. If we try to withdraw, they'll be on our flank. There's no way. No, Merrick repeated. We fight. That is the fool's path, Wilhelm sneered. Rowan walked tenderly toward Merrick, shaking her head sadly. Merrick, there's no point in fighting. You would just die. Then I die. His voice was firm. The Earl waved his hand dismissively. No, I understand that you're trying to be brave, lad, but this is the time for discretion. Merrick set his jaw. And I understand what you're getting at, your grace, but that's not your decision. Earl Rendor turned now, regarding Merrick with growing rage. Not my decision. I lead this army. My army, Merrick insisted. Or don't you follow your king? I don't see a king here, the Earl said. I see a boy who's trying to be brave. Queen Mora would have understood. She would have left these men if she had to for the rebellion to live on. She's dead, Merrick slammed his fist down on the table hard, and I would rather die beside these men than abandon them to save my own skin. I won't do it. Don't be stubborn. There's no point in fighting. Just lose. Just to lose. Then we win. Logan suddenly blurted out. His interruption was unexpected enough that even Earl Rendorm stared in surprise. Owen arched her brow curiously as Logan came forward, his expression annoyed. Don't stay and lose, he repeated. Stay and win. Rowan held out her hands helplessly. We can't. It isn't that simple. Why? Logan fronted her. Because he told you so? The Earl stiffened. I know what I'm talking about. I don't doubt it. Logan crossed his arms, watching the Earl. But my father stayed one step ahead of people just like you for years by doing the unexpected. And I understand your father is dead. Our camp was surrounded just like your army. If we had half the warning you have had, half the equipment, had any of the magic, my father would have seen us through it. His tone was iron hard. I know it. The Earl shook his head. No, you're wrong. You have advantages you don't even know about. Trust me, you can win. Merrick took a step toward Logan, hope creeping across his face. Do you have an idea? Logan paused, his eyes darting uncertainly among Arwen, Rowan, and Merrick, as if he'd just realized that they were all in fact paying attention to him. For a moment, it seemed he might back down, but then Merrick saw in those icy blue eyes. Resolve. Yes, Logan nodded. I do. And that ends part 4, everyone. I hope you guys enjoyed it and are looking forward to chapter 5. I'll see you guys next time on the reading of The Stolen Throne.